appreciate the viewers and the views that we're already getting, and this is becoming really fun. Now we're going to get into actually starting to work on the engine, and the first step is going to be installing the cam bearings. So today I have plenty of help for this task. I have my son, Robert Grayson Morgan, and I have my fur babies. I have Boone Morgan, Aries Morgan, and Daisy Mae Morgan. So today what we're going to do, the first thing we're going to do is I want to show everyone the tools that I have and that I'm going to need for today's task. It may be a little, some people may say it may be a little overkill on the tools, but I want to make sure that everything is properly measured and that the installation goes as smooth as possible. So the first thing is, let's look at the tools that I have. So I have a micrometer here that I'm going to use to measure the different bores in the engine, the camshaft bearings. This is a self-made checklist that I made so when I take my measurements I can write them down and compare them to between the old bearings and the new bearings. I'm using a standard off-the-shelf degreaser. I'm going to be using a flashlight to inspect the oil galleries. I'm going to be using a Sharpie, and the Sharpie is for to mark the bearings. I'm going to use a hammer, and this is a bearing installation tool. There's a lot of different ones on the market, but what I like about this one in particular is it is made specifically for the LS Gen 3 engines. And I think that I got this off of Amazon for about $60. They can range in price anywhere from $24 up to $150, but I kind of went with a medium one that specialized to the engine. So if you notice that the hammer end it's all solid metal. This is the alignment tool, and then this is the end of the tool that seats the actual bearings. I have an oil can. All I put in here was a 10W30 standard motor oil, a pair of rubber gloves, because something that's very important about this bearing installation is that your surfaces are extremely clean and that there's no dust, dirt, any kind of scratches, metal, anything, because it could cause problems in the future after you install it. And I have a very clean, it's not been used before, shop towel that that I'm going to use to clean with. So let's go ahead and get started. First of all, these are the old bearings that I removed. The way that I place them on the table is to mirror the way that the engine is sitting, so it reminds me which bearing came out of which area, because each bearing in an LS will have different measurements. But for example, the number 1, and I'll basically refer to 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 as the bearing numbers, and number 1 position, number 1 bearing will go into the number 1 cam bore right here. So these, as I said, are the old bearings, and you can kind of see that they're in rough shape. They have a little burning and scoring, and this is the Engine Tech replacement kit that I'm going to use. One thing to notice about this, and here is a view of the part number and where it's made, but notice something where it says 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. That's the same thing that I was kind of talking about when I was numbering, when I was showing the number of the bearings. Now, the first bearing is a B339, the second bearing is a B336, the third bearing is a B338. But notice that the fourth bearing is a B336, which is the same as the second bearing, and the fifth bearing is a B339, which is the same as the first bearing. So the way that these should measure is bearing number 1 and bearing number 5 should be the same size. Bearing number 2 and bearing number 4 should be the same size. And bearing number 3, which is also the center bearing, it's going to measure different. So how do I know that? A lot of times when you get the cam bearings, they come from the producer normally in the proper position that they should be. However, you never know if something got moved around. So I like to measure to make sure that I'm putting the right bearing in the right place. So the first thing that I want to do is I want to find out what the actual bore measurement in the block is. And when I say bore measurement, I'm talking about this bore right here. So I turn the engine over so that we can all have a better view of the bearings, where I'm going to install them, how I'm going to install them, and what the position is. So even though I flipped the engine over, now this is still position 1, 2, 3, 4, and 5. And the bearings are going to go inside of these bores right here. So what I use to measure the bore is a lot of people can use a bore, a dial indicator. They tend to be very expensive. So what I did for $18 was I purchased what's called a telescoping gauge. And what's really neat about these gauges is that you have the telescoping part, and these are flexible. This is your locking mechanism, which will lock it in place when you have your measurement. Then once that you have that locked, then you can use this tool to measure the width. So let's go ahead, and what we will do is get the first measurement in the first bore. You want to do that? So kind of how I explained it. And there's oil galleries right in the engine there on the left side on this. You don't want to put it in the oil gauge because it'll give you the wrong bore. I would say to use it just like that. And you're going to measure number 1. And kind of, you want to move it around a little bit so that you can see that you do have the right measurement, and then lock it in place. Okay, so now that he has that position locked, what we want to do, you want to be very careful of this though. So we want to pull another measurement because this anvil is all the way against the actual mount. You want your anvil's sharing distance to get an appropriate measurement. Watch the oil gallery here. There you go. So now that the device is locked, this is the actual indication of my bore. So then I take this tool and as you move this tool, it changes. So one thing that I want to do, make sure my edges are clean. This tool is very sharp. And then I want to measure the distance. Now once that I measure that distance, I can lock this device down there. So I'm at 59.61. Okay, so now if you want to do 2, 3, 4, and 5. Do you want to pull the measurement on the next one?
No, I'll just do this.
Okay. Now, the way, because of, like, if you want to measure this one in the center, is unlock it. You don't want to scratch this surface, so you kind of push them together. Like that. And see how I put it back there? And then pull it back towards you. But you want to make sure that on the end of your anvils that they stay pretty clean. So now you want to measure bearing 2. There you go. This is very tedious, but it's worth it because you're going to get accurate measurements. So, bearing position number 2. We unlock it again. We're at 58.7. See, that was a big change. Okay. Or 59. You can give or take a little bit, but when it comes to machining and checking your bore sizes, accuracy is the key. There's really not much play in the mechanical functions of the engine. You want to get it as close as possible, and you want to make sure it's in tolerance. So now that we have the actual bore measurements out of the engine block, I want to check my new bearings to see how close that they are to the measurements. One way that I like to do that is I like to take the old bearing, and I did clean these, but the measurements could vary very little. But what I do is I use the telescopic gauge again, and I measure the inside and lock it down and do it per bearing to make sure that I have the bearings matched. Once that I know that I have the bearings matched, then I'm going to check against what I have for the external diameter to make sure that each bearing and the way it was packed is in the correct position. And then I'll explain how we make sure that we are putting the bearing in the right place. And then we'll actually go into the bearing installation, and then we'll start looking at the crankshaft. So the first thing I want to do is I want to take my telescopic gauge, put it inside the bearing, that's my initial measurement. So if the bearings were packed correctly, I should be able to take number 1 here, number 2, just take them straight from the box. So each bearing should be the same. They're going to measure different, but they should be the same. So that's the measurement that I pulled from there, and it's a great fit. So one thing about bearings that I want to point out is that these holes allow engine oil to lube the camshaft. So basically what happens is the camshaft, even though it seems that it's metal to metal from here to here and here, there's actually a very fine film of oil that almost makes it float, if you will, to keep it lubricated. So now that I know that these bearings are the way that they should be, and I might have got that order messed up, but remember, these bearings are the same measurement, these are the same, and these are the same. So we could go 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. So we know number 5's good. Number 1 is good. Number 2 feels good. And while I'm doing this too, I want to just make sure I keep the edge clear. Number 3 is good. So now that we've verified that our bearings do in fact match, and they have the same exact measurement down to the 10th thousandth, I want to give a shout out to Engine Tech. The bearings were packed correctly. The packaging was received very nice. Definitely a good product so far. I can't wait to see how it performs, but so far I'm very pleased. So shout out to Engine Tech. Excellent engine parts at a very affordable price. And I think that on the box they are, let's see where they're made. They're made in Colombia. And earlier in the video I did a close-up of the parts numbers. So now, because I've got a little confused earlier, I'm going to go ahead and just remind myself which bearing is which. So all I did was basically just number the bearings in the position, and I also marked on the side of the engine block so that you can see the positions as I talked. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Another thing to point out is I want to show the position where the oil gallery is. This is the oil gallery. That's where you want to make sure that you have one of those holes. So what happens in the engine is the engine oil flows through this main system, and you can see that this oil gallery feeds into this. So you can actually, once you get your bearing installed, you can look down and see, and almost in every single one you can see that your bearing is in the correct place. So before I start my installation, I want to do, perhaps again, the most important thing, and that's to make sure that my surfaces are clean and free of dirt. And as I mentioned in my earlier video, I like to use coffee filters because coffee filters are lint free, and they'll also show you if there's any dirt on the board. I'm just using regular purple power. I got from the auto parts store today. It was 50% off. I always try to look for, especially when you're doing a budget build, I always try to look for the expensive things that will work, but when I have a chance to buy a really nice product, I do if it's on sale. So let's go ahead and check bearing number 1. Very little residue. That's clean. And what I want to do before I install the bearings is, with very clean hands, I'm going to use just a little bit of engine oil on the outside of the bearing to help it slip into the bore on the engine. So what I like to start with is number 5, because once your bearing is in place, you want to be very careful. You don't want to scratch the surfaces on the inside of the bearing, because if you get anything in there, it's going to eat away at your camshaft and ruin your bearings. So, again, as I mentioned, there are 2 holes in the bearing. What I want to do is make sure, and notice that the holes are in the center of the bearing. So it's not offset in any manner. But what I want to do is make sure that I get one of these holes into the position of where that oil gallery is. And what I'm going to do is actually, I'm going to mark it with my Sharpie to make sure that I have it in the right position. And when I inspect to make sure that the hole is lined up with the oil gallery, I just put a mark kind of at the 12 o'clock position to remind me where it's at. So after I know where I want to put my bearing, the next thing that I'm going to do is I want to lightly oil the outside to help with installation. But before I do that, I want to make sure also, as I mentioned, that the tool bearing seat is clean, because I don't want it scratching the inside of the bearing. So I know that this is my 12 o'clock position. I slide it on that, and then basically once that I get it where I want it in the engine, I put it on the end of the tool and drive it in. Now what I do is I want to put my bearing in place to make sure that you get a good seat on the bearing. Okay, so now that we have our anvil in place, now we're actually going to get the other part of the tool, and you want to be careful sliding this part of the tool in through the block, that you don't damage your bearing journals. Now, once that the tool is seated into the bearing, you want to fully seat the alignment portion of the tool. So, when the tool is properly in, you want to see this fully seat. Then you'll see the shaft of the tool all the way down to the anvil, with the bearing on the anvil and the mark in the 12 o'clock position. So now, what you want to do, and it may take a bigger hammer, it may take a lot more force, but you want to use what you need to do to get the bearing to seat, and then you can drive it to its final position. There we go. You feel like kind of like, there you go, yeah. I'm going to need a bigger hammer. There it goes. You see it?
Yeah.
Okay, so now that you have seated the anvil all the way to this position, let's check the bearing and see if it needs to go any way or if it's sitting where it needs to sit. First thing is you just remove, again, the shaft of the tool, and do not damage So if you look at the bearing closely, you'll see that we need to go in more. So I'm going to take it in just a little bit more. That should look really nice. Oh, I'm pretty happy with that. Maybe just a touch more. Like barely. Boy, imagine trying to do this without this tool. Put your foot on the engine stand. Here we go. I'm feeling like that's where I want to be. Okay, so the bearing is in the position that I want it in. Now what I want to do is I want to make sure, just double checking behind myself, that the oil gallery hole is lined up. Okay, so what I did was I used this tool to make sure that I still had the oil passage. Another way to check is you can shine a light down through the oil gallery and see if you see it on the bearing. cam bearing installation is now complete. So that wraps up the cam bearing installation, and I'm very happy with everything. I double checked all my passages to make sure that I had clear passage of the oil. The bearings went in really smooth, great product, and thank you, Ray, for your help. I appreciate it. Again, we look forward to the next episode. The next episode, we're going to start fitting the crankshaft and checking our bearings and getting our clearance and how we do that and the different tools that we can use to do that. But I would like to give Dee Nisbeth a shout out. I appreciate your feedback on the videos, and it's helping me get better with time. The videos as well, learning process, and but I'm enjoying it a lot. And Grayson, I appreciate your help today. I appreciate you helping with the bearings. It would have been difficult to do it with one person. So, thank you for stopping by, and I look forward to the next episode.